Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, Capital Markets Analyst and host of your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we've got Robert Laurie. He's with Lucem Law up in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's an attorney up there and into the cannabis space as well as some psychedelics. Rob, thanks for being back on the podcast.
Thank you, Josh. Great to be here.
So we're going to talk about a reality check for Canadian cannabis companies. There's a capital crunch, obviously, not just in the cannabis space, but just about everywhere. And so cannabis is not going to cannabis is going to get hammered. And so I've said in the past that the cannabis industry is like a vice, and they have an inverse relationship with defensive stocks, tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis. However, having said that, with all of the margin calls lately, they're not going to, the cannabis industry is not going to get away from this initial crash. Everything, including gold, is getting absolutely hammered. People are liquidating everything. And if they aren't, their brokerage firm is putting margin calls on people, creating even more of a depressed market. And so until a floor happens with margin calls, nobody's going to be safe. But eventually, there will be safe havens in defensive or vice stocks, sin stocks. We just have to get to that point. So I do want to kind of run into this article, see the advantages of Uruguay. I'm going to talk about Puerto Rico, of course. And then what are some alternatives? And according to Leafly, we've got some cheap legal weed in Canada. So we'll have to get into that in a moment. But reality check for some of these growers, some of these LPs who think that $1.74 per gram is going to keep them a going concern, keep them in business. And yet with the market right now, I think that's kind of a hope and a prayer.
Well, it's not a good time to be a legal, publicly traded company that is not well funded. And, you look at Canopy this morning, they're still about $6 billion company. That's about easily half of what they were a few months ago. But the majority of the other leading legal large LPs, like your Afrias, your Auroras, your Tilrays, your Kronos Group, which is the Peace Naturals Project, they're sitting, if they're lucky, at somewhere between $500 and $1 billion valuation. That's a big gap between 5-6 billion and 1.5 billion. So of all the companies out there, Canopy can survive. I mean, they can literally be ground right down to pretty much the nub of the pencil, and that pencil will still be longer than anyone else in the market. Bad news, however, if you're not clearly as well capitalized as Canopy. I mean, Aurora, we're seeing a 90% loss over the last little while. Tilray is right down. I mean, Tilray, again, was kind of the golden boy of Washington State, being backed by the privateer fellas, who certainly had a big part in the development of Canadian legal policy, along with some of the other lobbying groups. So at the moment, I have, mixed feelings. I feel terrible for the families and the businesses and the employees and the investors, because this is not the bill of goods they were sold. But at the same time, I remain optimistic that, a lot of these big public companies who played a part in this legalization will hopefully die a death worse than cancer, which means out of that, we can start over and have a sensible crack at devising a legal commercial market that will make sense. And, on that note, last time we sat down, Josh, I was under the understanding that, of course, the Washington State system is more or less looking to go back to the drawing board due to the perceived issues and failures and the lack to truly capitalize on this new market.
Yeah, Washington is definitely a petri dish experiment. We just had a bill that tried to go through the House for a cap on THC limits, and so there's a lot of issues with Washington State as a whole, and a lot of those companies will fail for the same reasons that some of these Canadian companies will. Like you mentioned with that Tilray write-off of $112 million, that doesn't really instill confidence to investors when you have a fiduciary duty to be efficient and you're not. And we've seen that with Canopy over and over again, just these press releases that generate no revenue. right? So Constellation Brands just came out and was like, we're not giving you guys any more money. You need to be profitable off your own. At this point, 2 years legalization, you're going to have to start making your own money. So whether that is moving to Uruguay or just figuring it out, I mean, I've seen on the news that you had some Guatemalan laborers, and so whether it's offshore or outsourcing your labor or outsourcing your grow, the chief executive officer at Silver Peak Life Sciences out of Uruguay said everyone's waking up to the fact that it doesn't make sense to grow cannabis in the tundra of Canada. So you have to look at other places.
But I'm not really going to hold my breath for Uruguay or the developing third world to save us. All the developing countries are going to do and is effectively just lower the price of the commodity overall, because of course they can produce for significantly lower of a cost than we can in Canada. But Canada has a very rich culture and history of protectionary tariffs, so that $50 or $5 bottle of Cuban rum that, you know, a Canadian tourist can buy in Veradero for $5 is $45 to $55 a bottle in a Canadian government liquor store. So that, you know, 36 to dollar produced gram in Nigeria, by the time it finally makes its way to the Canadian market and through the tariffs and the barriers and the taxes and just the cost of now getting it to market. I mean, if we've got border and transportation blocks and closures between Europe and the United States, well, I can't see how we're not going to have further border closures from, you know, Caribbean jurisdictions, South American jurisdictions, Asian jurisdictions, Australasian. So these cheap alternatives are just that, they're alternatives, but will they ever be of consequence, at least in the next few months, to the Canadian or continental United States markets? And my answer is no. No one's going to care because the product's not going to make it here, which means you have a dichotomy of a failed legal system with products that people don't want to buy, but are buying at, you know, double the value. And with all these layoffs and changes in the markets, that's just forcing the black market or operators who are now operating off grid, who still have the ability to get their product to market, whether it be walk it over, drive it over, courier it, mail it, or folks just come and pick up, or they operate in a pop-up style market. That you're going to see a lot more of, especially if if this pandemic has anything to say about it. Because let's face it, law enforcement and municipal and government resources, if you're busy trying to maintain that thin blue line between order and chaos, you're probably not going to be diverting your preciously and badly needed law enforcement and government resources to some black market pot. Right. That again is going to be another, all those workers, whether the ones that weren't Guatemalan or not at Canopy, but at least the local growers, they're going to have to pay, make up for their families somehow. And I guess, growing pot on the black market is a good way to ensure that, the mortgage is saved. And yeah, these big companies laying off their labor left, right, and center are just now filling the benches on the black market, which again, I think it's a good time to be a lawyer, but not necessarily a good time to be over leveraged as a public company.
It's going to get interesting with international shipments. Uruguay had shipped some product to California to be tested. And if, Soros has anything to say about it, they're definitely going to be producing more. They're currently restricted at 330,000 pounds a year, which seems like a lot. But if there's any issues like we've seen out of South Korea with listeria in some of the agricultural crops, there's going to be even more testing, more, cost to the consumer. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with that. You
mentioned South Korea, just a little tidbit. I don't want to get too distracted here, but South Korean nationals, right? Their law with respect to cannabis applies abroad. So if you're a South Korean, you go to Canada for, some tourism and you're like, oh, what's this pot? I'd like to try some. And even if you go to a legal Canadian store and buy legal licensed produced weed, you're still breaking the law under South Korean law. So that's that, separate point, but that's interesting.
It is. Another quick thing that's interesting is Puerto Rico. So in the US, if you go anywhere else like South Korea or Iran, Cuba, you can work anywhere and be taxed as an American. We're one of 2 countries that do that across
Yeah,
the
you're
globe.
taxed worldwide regardless of domicile.
Except if you're in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Ricans don't have congressional representation, but as an American territory, and Puerto Ricans are American, they don't have that congressional representation. So you can't have taxation without representation. So Puerto Rico is the only place in the world you can go as an American or American business.
But what about Guam and American Samoa and Marshall Islands and places like that, which are like American protectorates, but they're not, 50 states status?
They do have congressional representation. Puerto Rico is the only American territory that doesn't have congressional representation, which makes it the only place in the world you can operate from and not pay corporate income tax.
So was it designed to be like a version of the American British Virgin Islands? Is that some of the idea of like protectorate status going back to the Platt Amendments with Teddy Roosevelt? Is that sort of the origins?
So a Cayman Island UK trust account is a secretive, not legal tax haven loophole, whereas the Puerto Rico is completely legit, transparent, and legal. So, on the surface, they're the same. It's a way to not pay taxes. One's legal and one's not. So going to Puerto Rico, for bilingual call center research and development or sales or whatever, that's an opportunity, especially for CBD companies that can operate anywhere. It's my opinion that 85% will fail if you don't have an entity in Puerto Rico for the 4% corporate tax cap, 50% tax credits, 100% tax deductions in some cases. And so as things get more tight, more competitive, you're going to need all the margins you can to survive.
And yes and no. There's a great book I invite you to look at. I'll have to take a look just for the author, but the title is basically the last true tax haven for a Canadian is the United States. And they use the business case analysis between 2 partners. They sell the business and one sets up in Arizona. The other then, takes his winnings and his money and goes to Cayman Islands. And they look at, well, actually, who fares better? And, provided travel's not an issue and there are no other shipping and other restrictions, it's quite comparable. But in the instance of if you can't fly to your business and you can't get money and asset out of the business, that's a problem. Whereas for a Canadian in the Caymans, they got to come home. But a Canadian living in Arizona, right, as a snowbird, well, they can vote with their feet and come back to Canada, and it's a different scenario. So, I caution a lot of these people claiming that there's alternatives and substitutes internationally. Let's assume that the borders are shut down and now we're looking at a John Carpenter's escape from New York or escape from LA type scenario. I don't think there's going to be much consequence for really anything outside the borders if it can't reach there. And the same possibly could apply for Puerto Rico. But again, I don't know what the shipping and priority is like with respect to how FedEx treats Puerto Rico, for example, and whether Puerto Rico would be one of the first to go with respect to, quarantine and the like. But it's interesting to see. And then to your next point about the reality check about other brands you had Hexo and Tilray effectively trying to come out with these affordable ounces for about $140, which that's still expensive. I can get a good ounce for anywhere for about $100. And that's a bog standard. A quad ounce, yeah, you'd be willing to spend more than $100, but the equivalent of what you're seeing in the LPs, again, underdeveloped, irridated, pre-frozen flower in some instances, yeah, it's not even in the same boat. And that is effectively a double-edged sword because you're now paying effectively for something that if you knew the value and the cost of it, you wouldn't think that's a very good deal. And that's another roadblock, I guess, that these LPs have to go up against because, I don't want to sound like I'm being a smartass, but it's almost like a lot of these LPs pulled the wool over the eyes of the general public
100%.
and dealt with the Canadian government as if the Canadian government, was believing all of this, and they did. And now the consumer, everybody's waking up. It's almost like the blinders were on, now they're off. And it's like, wait a minute, this is something I could produce myself at 36 cents a gram, for sake of argument, if I was allowed to. And if there hadn't been 93 years of prohibition, what would the price of like fully THC cannabis be today? I mean, it was 36 cents a gram in 1937. I'm sorry, 37 cents a gram in 1936, the year more or less when the Marijuana Stamp Act came out. So adjust for inflation, right? These legal companies have to realize the only reason they're selling something at $5 a gram and the black market selling something at $5 plus a gram is because of 97 years of prohibition, and all these financial models, right, are not being based on a true market. It's being based on what law enforcement and the government think is a fair price for something that wasn't really fair in the first place. So, coronavirus is just the fuel to the fire that's getting us closer to this race to the bottom, to where we can actually create an industry.
Yeah, I would definitely take a look at Oregon to see what the future wholesale low prices will be for wholesale and retail. An ounce down there is $30 to $40. Every 420 for the last 3 or 4 years, I've gone to 20 stores on 420. And what I've noticed is that about 2 years later, those 420 prices, the sales prices, become the everyday discount retailer low price. So that's the Uncle Ike's retail store here in Washington. They're the low budget store, and their everyday prices were 2017 or 2018's 420 price. So I think if you're looking at $125 an ounce is cheap, then you're not looking at what the future will be. Just like you said, the Canadian companies that think $1.74 in order to break even or stay in business is not going to be around long term. It's kind of like the pitch decks I get where they think a pound is going to be $4,000, in Philly and New York, or water soluble at $18,000 a kilo. It's like, you guys are pulling the wool over some investors' eyes. This is not the way. I mean, maybe now, maybe black market, but like you said, it's going to be a race to the bottom, as any commodity is. It's a quick drop, and that's why a lot of these people are going to be outsourcing the production of it, because it's just a commodity. It's not that gold that people thought that they were making.
I think there's also the quality of the product. So when you take Canopy, that's trying to be the flagship representative of the cannabis industry, and yet outsourcing labor from indigenous and unskilled labor and paying them minimum wage, I don't know if that's really a reflection on true values of a Canadian company. I mean, if I would gladly probably pay a little bit more for weed, again, knowing that this is a Canadian company taking care of Canadian families, growing a Canadian product with pride. Again, especially now at a time where values have such an important part in our purchasing decisions. I mean, folks in Canada just won't buy legal weed out of principle, right? They don't care if Drake's involved, or Willie Nelson, or Tommy Chong, or the Toronto Raptors, or Seth Rogen. No, I mean, this effectively is something that should be sold at really good cannabis should be a couple dollars a gram at best, and all sorts of substitutes in between. But again, if you can't make a profit and realize a margin, then that's not my problem, right? That's kind of like the automotive industry, selling and designing and manufacturing irrelevant technology for the last 30, 40 years and then requiring a bailout. Well, I really hope that this industry doesn't get a bailout, because to do so, what I think would just enable further stupidity and further failure. I mean, government just has to look at examples like Oregon. I mean, if Oregon could ship weed and get rid of some of the excess, then fine. But that's a perfect example of what any market would look like. if you're allowed to grow cannabis and you can't export it. So again, what does that say? Does that say about the industry, or does that say about the stupidity of the industry?
Well, the Canadian, like Health Canada, seems like they're a little out of touch or tone deaf.
They're very out of touch, and they're very tone deaf.
Their 10 milligram caps are ridiculous. The waste on packaging that I've seen with pre-rolls and edibles with the 10% cap, I thought Washington State's 100 milligram cap was ridiculous. Completely eliminates all of the medical patients out there who need 1,000 or 5,000 or whatever it is. 100 is nothing. So I don't even buy edibles. But when I went up to Canada, me and Katrina Glogowski, who you know as well, she's an attorney and angel investor here in Seattle. She went to a store and had no idea that it wasn't a legitimate rec store. I went to a different one. I knew what I was doing because I asked, like, hey, where's the closest place? And they're like, it's right there behind those black doors with no sign. And then I walk in and it looked like out of a movie. Like you go down this hallway and then there's this door and then this other door is covered with plastic. And then you go in there and there's some jar and you look at the strain and it says weed on it. You're like, is that sativa or indica? And the guy's like, weed is weed, man. You're like, whoa. Okay,
well, that's just it. I mean, that's not how it was in the old days. Like when you had 100+ dispensaries, the quality of the cannabis was in check. Crappy weed, bad growers, poor product. I mean, that name and those reputations would get around town, and their weed wouldn't be fetching anywhere near a price. And you just weren't having the same degree of problems as you are now. And I think it's, especially, you look at with this virus, there's going to be a lot more people growing weed and doing a whole bunch of other stuff as just a means to get by, whether it's for cash or trade or, that's what their business. But that is what legal business, if they couldn't compete with that before, they're certainly not going to compete with it now.
Yeah, these $4 and $5 price per grams are not going to remain for much longer. So before we wrap this up, what is your crystal ball prediction as we kind of are just getting hammered right now in the stock market? And a lot of these companies may or may not be around by the time this coronavirus ceases to make its impact. What's your crystal ball say for the rest of the year?
Well, crystal ball is anyone's guess right now, but I think the logical safe bet is if you don't need to be in the public markets, don't get in them. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I make my money by solving client problems, and I don't want other problems by investing. And right now, I mean, I've been saying for the last 2-3 years, this is exactly what's going to happen. I did not foresee the coronavirus, but the coronavirus, again, is just that added validation of, well, we're at where we're at. And crystal ball is we're going to have to get through the next 2 months. The next 2 months will then enable us to see what kind of damage was done within that period, and then what does it look like fixing that. But at the moment, we're kind of on the edge of the void, and any second we're going to get pushed off. We have no idea how long we're going to free fall for, and what the impact will be when we actually land. So I don't know. I think it's really a time almost to turn inward and almost be looking at, well, your personal individual situation and that of your families, and realize, what do we need to do in the next 2 months? And other than check stock, I don't think you need to do too much more with it. Mm-hmm. But the big concluding point is change is good. I mean, what was in place was not working. And human beings, or humans as a civilization, are quite remarkable. I mean, if we keep doing things the way that we're not supposed to, well, things are going to get worse. But I think this is a novel and a new time for innovation, new strategies, new techniques, new thoughts, new ways of looking at things that hopefully will resonate with the government. Because if they keep trying to do what they're doing the way they're doing it now against this new virus and everything else, it's just going to be more of the same, Josh. More of the same. That's it. That's my crystal ball. More of the same for at least 2 months.
Yeah. Well, with that, we're going to roll this one up. I want to thank my guest, Robert Laurie. He's with Lucem Law up in Vancouver, British Columbia. Appreciate you being back on the podcast.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure.
I'm Josh Kincaid. This is the Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Or don't. And I'm out.